Okay, this is David Spence once again, University of Texas School of Law, and this is the third of 3 videos on the subject of complexity and the energy transition. And in this last part of the series, I'm going to talk about the current legislative politics of passing climate legislation, major climate legislation. The basic argument is contained in the 3 bullets you see on this slide. The man pictured here is Ted Halstead, who recently died tragically at a young age. He is known as a champion of climate bipartisanship. He was the creator of a very popular TED Talk on this subject, the tagline of which was, "The path to climate progress runs through the Republican Party." I don't know if that's true, but the more general point that is axiomatically true is that the path to successful national climate legislation runs through the ideological center of Congress. People in every filter bubble are represented in Congress, some more than others, frankly, and so engagement across filter bubble lines, across ideological lines and party lines is probably going to be necessary to build the kind of legislative majorities we need for durable climate legislation. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. Historically speaking, Congress's willingness to pass major regulatory legislation, the kind that rearranges the costs and benefits of economic activity in a significant way, has mostly been confined to a few short periods in our history when the conditions were just right. Most of the regulatory state was created during the 3 periods you see here, which collectively comprise about a fifth of Congress's history. So major regulatory legislation is infrequent, or at least Congress is infrequently disposed to pass it. But as you can see from this long list of bills, and these are all big regulatory bills, it does happen, usually because some public outcry for regulation becomes strong enough that Congress has to respond. Policy scholars have studied these periods of regulatory activity. They've coined a variety of different phrases and terms to describe these situations when the public outcry is particularly strong. And you can see some of them on the left side of the slide here: the Overton window, Republican moments, the issue attention cycle. But when we look back at these periods of regulatory energy, we find that yes, the public outcry is present, but it's not enough by itself. You also have to have a receptive environment in Congress, either by partisan makeup or by ideological makeup, such that almost every one of the bills you see here on this slide was passed with much more than just a bare amount of majority support. They were passed with substantial majorities. This happens in either of 2 ways. One is when the majority party in Congress enjoys such large margins in both houses, as well as controlling the presidency, that they can just impose their will on the opposition party. In the New Deal, for example, the Democrats' margins were enormous. The smallest margin Democrats enjoyed in the House during the 6 years of the New Deal was 126 seats. Smallest margin in the Senate was 23 seats. That's 23 more Democrats than Republicans in the Senate. And they got bigger in the other years of the New Deal. So that seems like the kind of partisan environment that's not likely to be found here in the present day. Here is Nate Silver writing a couple of weeks ago. This is being recorded in early October. Underscoring the problems that Democrats have in Senate elections. Rural voters are overrepresented in Senate elections. Rural voters tend to be conservative and Republican. And so at least under current conditions, the prospects of Democrats earning big majorities in the Senate seem dim. So what's the other situation in which major regulatory legislation gets passed? These are situations when a kind of temporary bipartisanship arises, usually because the regulatory issue in question is new and both parties are competing to be identified with it. So back in the progressive era, You will recall that Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, and Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, both wanted their parties to be identified as progressive parties and to earn the votes of people who were pushing progressive issues. In the 1970s, Republicans were competing for the mantle of environmental leadership. Richard Nixon signed the order that created the EPA, signed the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and a lot of other major environmental legislation. And as late as the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, the president was campaigning to be, quote, the environmental president, close quote, and signed major substantive amendments to the Clean Air Act. Those periods of competition don't last. And in both of those cases both the examples I gave, Democrats ultimately won the mantle of progressive and environmental leadership. And so if we look back at the 1970s and the ideological makeup in Congress, we can see why bipartisanship was possible. This is a figure that's created from the same data I referenced in one of the prior videos. This is data that puts members of Congress on an ideological spectrum from left to right. And if we look at Congress, this is the House in the 1970s, the early 70s, you can see that the parties were much more heterogeneous ideologically. There was ideological overlap between them. And that means that the most conservative Democrat sat to the ideological right of the most liberal Republican. That's not true anymore. Now there's no ideological overlap between the parties, and the median members of each party have moved farther apart. In particular, the Congressional GOP has moved sharply to the right. Unfortunately, as probably most viewers of this video know, in today's GOP, opposition to climate policy for many members is kind of a pillar of party doctrine. So much so that Republicans, or some Republicans who support climate action, risk losing primary challenges, all of which makes Ted Halstead's dream of a bipartisan climate policy seem like a pretty tall order right now. So the question is, what can we do? Well, we can face this reality and get to work on two fronts. One of those fronts is to try and create a future Congress that's more receptive to climate policy. That means, frankly, right now, working to elect more Democrats, because regardless of what voters want, including Republican voters, climate policy is a non-starter in a Senate in which Mitch McConnell is majority leader. But I would argue that we ought not to give up on a weak version of Ted Halstead's vision. Climate impacts will continue to worsen, and Republicans in climate-impacted areas may begin to change their tune. Recently, the Trumpiest Republican in the House, Matt Gaetz, wrote that climate change is an urgent problem that we need to address now. It's probably not a coincidence that he represents Florida, is relatively young, and may believe that his electoral prospects in the future are improved by at least acknowledging that reality. So maybe climate reality will turn some Republican voters into Democrats, and maybe it will turn some Republican politicians into climate advocates. Some on the progressive left are optimistic about our ability to do this by crafting climate policies that would be distributive in nature. They would focus on distributing tangible economic benefits widely to enough voters to create a climate majority, a new Republican moment. And they tend to see ideology as a relatively weak driver of Republican opposition to climate policy. I don't share that optimism, but maybe they're right. We'll see. Or maybe other issues will sweep Democrats into office for reasons unrelated to climate, and maybe that will create an opportunity to pass a meaningful climate bill. So these are not unreasonable hopes, but realizing them in the next Congress or in the one after that seems likely to require events that don't seem possible or probable right now. But this is 2020. Who knows what will happen? And of course, there are elections beyond 2020. The huge New Deal majorities that I spoke of earlier weren't created in one election. They were accumulated over a series of two-year cycles. So who knows? In the meantime, we have the Congress we have. And so the second front on which we need to get to work is to do what we can now. A clear-eyed look at the current political landscape suggests that we should not succumb to rallying cries that I've heard, like half measures are the same as no measures. Clearly they're not, since all emissions reductions we can achieve now will reduce harms in the future. We should do now what we can do now. So we should hold on to that ambition. Ambition is good, but so is the truth. And part of that truth involves understanding the Senate that we have. Climate legislation in the next Congress will require the support of these Democrats you see here, who are the most ideologically conservative in Congress. These are ideological scores from a progressive group, but they're not inconsistent with other ideology scores that are out there. These members have constituents and electoral pressures that they have to face. Many of them serve states in areas that lean Republican or sometimes are even solidly Republican. So if these members raise concern about trade-offs or costs of the transition or how a transition will affect their home industries and their home constituents, you will hear people dismiss them as corrupt or in the pocket of industry or insufficiently brave or courageous. But those members are only doing what all members do. They're trying to protect their re-election prospects. And all legislation, including legislation to add new states or add judgeships or create constitutional amendments, all legislation has to go through these people, at least in the next Congress and probably the one after that one. It requires the support of the median voter in each chamber of Congress. So I'm going to finish or bookend this set of videos with another movie quote. We started with a movie quote. I'm going to end with a movie quote. This one is from Apollo 13. You'll recall that in that movie, people on the ground, including an astronaut named Ken Mattingly, were working in a simulator to try to figure out how the Apollo 13 crew could restart all the onboard computer systems necessary for re-entry into the Earth's orbit, given the very low levels of power that were left on the disabled ship. After failing in the simulator several times in a row, Mattingly sort of snaps at the engineers, saying something to the effect of, "We can't do what we need to do without all these systems." And the young engineer who's on the right of this photo responds with the quote you see here. He says, "Ken, you're telling me what you need. I'm telling you what we have to work with at this point." And that's where we are right now with climate policy. That could change, and people are working to change that, and that's good. But in the meantime, this is where we are, facing the political, technological, and economic realities and maintaining our sense of ambition and willingness to persist anyway. That's the mental tightrope we need to walk. And a lot of people are both consciously and unconsciously trying to push us off that tightrope, particularly online, in online conversations from both directions. So that's the end of the third and final video. I leave you with a couple of additional quotes we feature on the website, which are designed to reinforce the idea that we have to talk to one another. We have to talk to people of diverse perspectives. We have to resist the temptation to dismiss them, because that's what it's going to take to build the kind of majorities we need to make real climate progress. Thanks for your attention.